Welcome to the Core Women Podcast, the place for women entrepreneurs, authors, and self-starters looking to build community and gain valuable insights through expert interviews with women at the top of their game. Join your host, podcaster, producer, expert coach, entrepreneur, and author, Dr. Summer Watson, as she aims to inspire and empower you through these candid conversations. Lean in and embrace the journey. It's time to start the show. Here's your host, Dr. Summer Watson.
Today on the show, I would like to welcome Sandy Rosenthal, author, podcast host, and community organizer. Following Hurricane Katrina and the federal levee failures in New Orleans, Sandy founded the nonprofit levees.org with 25,000 supporters nationwide. Her book, Words Whispered in Water, is about how she exposed the culprit in the catastrophe and how the agency spent millions covering up its mistakes. She lives in New Orleans with her husband of 45 years, has 3 grown children and 2 grandchildren, and enjoys tennis and yoga. Get ready for a very insightful and engaging conversation. Welcome, Sandy.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
It is a pleasure. I can't wait to jump into this conversation. But before we get into some of the professional aspects of what has evolved in your life, I'm going to ask you this one question. If you could describe your journey in one word to this point, what would that word be and why?
A surprise.
Tell me more.
The reason is, if anyone could have told me 20 years ago that I would be a community mobilizer, an author, in addition to being a podcast host, I would say you've got the wrong person. Impossible. For all of the reasons that none of those persons were me 20 years ago. It has been an amazing and surprising journey.
Awesome. Let's get into the subject of Hurricane Katrina, the event, and what led you to researching the levee failures.
My circumstances were unusual. Most of the people after the flooding were caught without any of their belongings, without their checkbook, with all of the things you need to survive and live. I had packed for 3 weeks when I left New Orleans for Hurricane Katrina, only because my husband was an insurance agent and he had just seen the devastation of Hurricane Andrew recently before that. So I was in an unusual position. I had everything I needed. I could live for weeks outside of the city, and I could do something very few people could do. I could listen to the news, listen to the radio, watch television. I could do these things, which no one else could do. And immediately that put me on the path to seeing the wrong information that was being put out into the media. Most people were trying to survive.
Yeah.
Where am I going to work? Where are my kids going to go to school? Where am I going to live? That was what all of us were doing, and I was in an unusual space. And because of that, it put me on the straight and narrow path to figuring out what really happened in New Orleans, and here we are today.
Well, tell us more about that. Tell us more about how that evolved. And was that really a straight and narrow path, or was that an interesting path where you discovered things as you went along? Tell us how you went and approached that, as well as how that evolved and what you uncovered.
Certainly. So in the beginning, I used my certain brand of post-traumatic stress syndrome to research, like my life depended on it. And I continued to research, I continued to read, and gradually formed my own version of events. And I talked about this as well. I didn't keep this to myself. And my epiphany was when I was speaking to a gentleman from the town of Alexandria, not far from New Orleans. And I explained to him, the levees were fine. They were wrongly designed. This disaster should not have happened. He told me, 1, I was wrong, that the levees were fine. Katrina was a huge storm. And 2, people like me from New Orleans deserve no help because we shouldn't have been living there.
Oh,
that naturally, of course, enraged me. And I decided not only do I need to talk about this, I need to tell the world about it. I know it's naive, and it was, but I didn't know it at the time. And I set out to make sure the whole world knew about what happened here in New Orleans. And the first person I hired to help me was my 15-year-old son. Kids can do anything. And he created a website. He helped me with all of the tech. And we got the show on the road just a couple of months after Hurricane Katrina. which was the message that the flooding of New Orleans was not Mother Nature and not due to anything the people of New Orleans did or didn't do. It was engineering failure on the part of the federal government.
Okay, so you started poking the hornet's nest. Then what?
I definitely poked the hornet's nest and immediately got pushback. At the time, I didn't know it was the Army Corps of Engineers, but the Army Corps of Engineers immediately had hired people to harass me and intimidate me, either online or sending me emails in person. Immediately, from the day I started talking, the Army Corps put their minions to work. Believe it or not, the federal government has people that they sick on the American public when they say things that the government doesn't want us to know. I know it's hard to imagine our own federal government, and a lot of people had trouble believing it, but it's true. And I go into more of that in my book. So I stayed on track. I stayed with my belief. And you know what? I thought to myself, what if I'm wrong? I was just a citizen at large. What if I was wrong? What's the worst that could happen to me? So I kept talking and talking and talking and talking. I wouldn't say maybe it wasn't a narrow path, but I certainly never looked back. I only looked forward. How do I expose this engineering mistake? Because I knew that we were not going to get any trouble from Congress or the American people if they believed we brought this upon ourselves.
Right. And with others with that same mindset as that original person you spoke to who said, well, it's your fault. You live here and you don't deserve any help. Like that's just bonkers. So you kept at it, you kept poking, you kept uncovering. And can you share some of the challenges that you faced in exposing the agency, the Army Corps of Engineers? What were some of the mistakes?
There were many mistakes, but the most egregious mistake that caused the most of the flooding is the Army Corps of Engineers was looking for ways to save money. Anyone who has watched the documentary about Chernobyl knows the reason that Chernobyl was the disaster that it was, catastrophe is the proper word, is because the Russian people were looking for ways to save money. And the stopgap to prevent the explosion, the meltdown, didn't work because they'd used cheap materials. A very similar thing happened with the Army Corps of Engineers. They were behind schedule, costs were rising. They were looking for ways to save money on steel. Steel's expensive to buy. Steel is expensive to drive deep into the ground. So the Army Corps did a test and determined they only needed to drive steel sheet piling down into the ground 16 feet, 1/6, instead of 36. Big difference.
Wow.
And when Hurricane Katrina's storm surge arrived on August 29th, just 5 years later, they finished the levees in 2000. In 2005, when the storm surge arrived, and it was a moderate surge for a storm of that size, the levees flopped over. I'm not an engineer, but on some of the canals, the levees broke on both sides, which that's some weak canal wall.
Wow.
So that was it. The Army Corps made an engineering mistake in an effort to save money. There's nothing wrong with looking for ways to save money. We all do it every day. I know I do. The problem was they made a mistake, and the real crime is the Army Corps tried to cover it up. That was the biggest crime. And they harassed me and anyone who supported me for years. They finally stopped since the word is now out. It took 10 years to do it, though. And I discussed that more in my book.
So, as you begin to uncover this and really expose the issues here, what came of that? What did the government say? Did anything result from that that was positive for your city?
After the levees broke, you will not be able to find one single individual in the city of New Orleans who feels that they were properly and completely made whole afterward. In fact, if anything, that people will feel that the federal government totally let them down. The reason we survived was volunteers, our savings, money we had in insurance.
Yeah.
The city of New Orleans got very little help from the federal government, keeping in mind that for a long time, there was this belief that we brought this problem upon ourselves. However, one thing we did get from the federal government was a bright, gleaming, shiny new flood protection system that does work. And it has stood up to the test since it was built, since it was completed about 10 years ago. So we got a bright, shiny new system that's very expensive to maintain, but we did get that. So that's what the people of New Orleans got. As far as the rest of the country, a lot of changes have been made to make sure that nothing like this happens ever again. And I'll give you an example. A lot of people did not evacuate from New Orleans because they wanted to stay home and take care of their pets. You couldn't just take your pet on a bus at that time. And they stayed home and died with their pets. So since then, the federal government has passed a law that states in order to receive money from FEMA, you have to accommodate pets. And this is to save the owners. Okay, that's one example. There are many examples. The Army Corps of Engineers no longer uses the type of flood protection that failed during Hurricane Katrina. And those are just a couple, and I can give you a lot more in my book. Not only are the people of New Orleans better off, however, the entire country is better off because of the catastrophe that happened here.
Absolutely. And it's also better off because you said something. You started uncovering things. And once you started talking, did the city start also talking about this? Did they jump on board as well?
That's a great question. In the beginning, I had a little more difficulty getting people to jump on board, get on the train, so to speak. Keep in mind, this was a chaotic environment. Most people, as I've mentioned already, are trying to survive. Where will I live? Where will I work? And when you're dealing with those things, it's very difficult to become an activist.
Yeah, a champion for something. Right. Absolutely.
And I was fortunate. My house didn't flood. My husband's business didn't flood or nothing substantially. So in the beginning, it was tough. Also, keep in mind, politics can get in the way of what people do. We had at that time a Democrat governor and a Democrat mayor, and we had a Republican president. And those factors kind of got messy, and a lot of people will stick with a party line. And since this was a federal mistake, that reflects on the president at the time. Yeah, that was a bit of a problem. Now, I don't think anybody remembers anymore who was president during the Katrina disaster or who was the mayor. I mean, that was 19 years ago. In the beginning, that was a problem. So I had pushback from strange places that confused me at the time. It makes sense to me now. Politics, unfortunately, can get in the way of just seeing what's right there, right in front of you. And I doubt that's changed much.
I don't think that's changed much. I mean, you see it happening today, people sticking to their party lines. And it's unfortunate because I understand why it happens, but I think it also lends to losing that objectivity we need to cross those party lines to make a difference. It's people like you who start the conversation to make the change. Thank you for taking on that huge fight of sorts to get this recognized to make a change in community. And sometimes that is what it takes. It takes that one person to be what some people might call the whistleblower. Now that has inspired you to stand up the organization levees.org after Hurricane Katrina. Tell us more about this organization and how you help others.
Certainly. In the beginning, levees.org's mission was primarily just helping people understand what really happened. We felt that the survivors deserved it. I mean, many survivors lost loved ones. 1,400 people died in the flooding of New Orleans. So they deserved it, even if it just meant taking off a cloak of shame. Keep in mind, a lot of people who lost their home and loved ones and lost their town and their favorite places to go out to eat, they were being blamed for it. The victim blaming was rampant right after the flood. So at a minimum, they can throw off the cloak of shame. But the other reason we did it was much broader. For example, right now, my organization is focused on making sure that every single engineering student working toward their BS, that they receive instruction on engineering failures. And right now, they're not.
Really?
Really hard to believe, I know. A few universities are here and there, but not all of them. We want every single one to be instructed on failures. And that's our campaign that we rolled out in August of last year, and it's already gotten national attention.
I love what your organization is doing to recognize changes that need to be made because of something that challenged a city, challenged human beings to the point where they were not surviving. And here you are looking at these micro and macro situations that result from such a situation. You know, you wouldn't even think about the guilt of shame. Oh, what did I do? What could I have done better as an individual, as a city? But then you're looking at these macro issues where you're saying, how can we change this so another city doesn't incur this, that we don't incur the loss that we've taken here? You know, where other people will be in that struggle to fight the same fight. You started that conversation, you fought that fight, and things are changing. And I love that. I love that you were able to do that because it takes somebody strong with a community that is strong that can help hold you up in this fight, because it's not easy. As you said, you had a lot of pushback and there are a lot of people trying to shut you down and your voice down.
And in my mind, I looked at that pushback as I must be doing something right.
Yeah, good for you. Good for you. Well, thank you for constructing and standing up an organization that helps others and also is continuing to make change and getting recognition for that change, which is nice because once you get recognition, it does make a difference. So thank you for doing that. You've also written a book, Words Whispered in Water. Tell us more about this book.
As I've already mentioned, I'm not a journalist. I don't see myself as an author. So when one of my most valued advisors suggested I write a book, my reaction was, uh, okay. I really didn't want to. And it was very, very difficult to write. However, it needed to be done because, as my advisor pointed out, no one could tell this story but me. And that's what pushed me to do it. The story needed to be out there, the problems I had, the pushback I had, how I dealt with it, how I prevented burnout, and how I succeeded. All these things really needed to be put down in a book. And I'm not going to be around forever, but the book will.
Absolutely. And it's important that you write the book because that is your lived experience. And that lived experience evolved into an organization, evolved into this book. And it's also not just about the given situation, Hurricane Katrina. It's about having a voice. It's about if you feel or you suspect that something's not quite right, say something about it. Talk to others, consult with somebody, do something because it's going to lay on your chest. It's going to lay within you and not feel great. So there was a point in you where you said, I'm going to do it anyway. Because I'm sure at some point in your mind, as you started this trek to uncover A, B, or C, you questioned your own self.
100%. Keep in mind, not only am I not a journalist, I'm also not an engineer. And here I was saying this was an engineering mistake, and I'm not trained in any way in engineering. So what I had to do is say to myself, okay, I may not be an engineer, an attorney, or a politician, which I had to learn all about all those things to do my work. However, I can see, I can read, I can listen. I have my senses that I can use and figure out what doesn't make sense. The things I'm hearing don't make sense. And if they don't make sense to me, I do not understand how they could make sense to anyone. And I spoke up. Why I thought I knew better than everybody else, I was confused about that at the time. And believe me, I didn't want to lead this. I tried to find somebody else to lead it. And I spent about a week, it seemed like a long time at the time. I spent about a week trying to find somebody else. And when I couldn't, I said, well, I guess I'll have to do it,
Yeah.
which is often how things get done in this world.
Right. Here's the interesting perspective on this. So there are people like Erin Brockovich. She did the same thing. And I know that you have talked to her, met her. You're kind of leading your own charge as she did. And we do question ourselves. When we begin to unearth something or uncover something, we begin to question ourselves. But yet you still went forward and you pursued what you felt were questions that you need answers to. And people push back on that because they didn't want you to uncover the answers, but yet you did. And you, through all of that, continued to push forward. That evolved into an organization. It also evolved into a book. And that book is your phenomenology. It is your lived experience. With that said, we have covered so much today. As we come to the close of the interview, my last question for you is if you were to give the listeners one tip about how to shine light on something they know in their heart is not quite right, or about following their intuition, what would that tip be?
When you've spotted a problem and you see that something's wrong, you've obviously paid attention to it. You've obviously been doing the things we discussed. You've been listening, seeing, reasoning, thinking. And if you have come to that conclusion, you are right. And if you're a little bit concerned, let's look at the worst possible scenario. What if you were wrong? What if it turned up I was wrong about the Army Corps of Engineers? It wasn't their fault. Well, oh, my bad. My bad. In other words, I was a citizen at large. So Erin Brockovich and I are the same. We had no special training and we took down a monster. It's because we did the same things.
Mhm.
And so that's my advice to the listener. If you see a problem, you're right and stick with it.
Thank you, Sandy, for joining me on the Core Women podcast today.
You're so very welcome. Thank you.
Absolutely. You can follow Sandy Rosenthal on Instagram, X, and YouTube at levees.org and at levees.org. And you can check out her book on Amazon.
Thank you for joining us on the Core Women Podcast with Dr. Summer Watson. We're so glad you're here and would love to connect more with you. Find us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Core Women, and on Twitter at Core Women 1. For more about Core Women and Dr. Watson, visit corewomen.com. Want more support and resources for amazing women like you? Great! Join Dr. Watson and Jen Fontanilla at the Life, Love, and Money Collective, a Core Women production that aids in understanding the key traits that might be getting in the way of living a life that you are absolutely passionate about. Connect with Summer and Jen and find out more at thelifeloveandmoney.com.